Amidst sun-gilded seashore, salt-washed breeze, and the occasional cacophony of seagulls, a weathered old man drags an equally old and worn dory up and onto a lonely rock in the middle of the cove. He's been looking forward to this moment all day, a chance to get away from everyone and everything, to lose himself in the soothing breath of the tide, as well as his stories. These are stories from the rock. Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of Stories from the Rock. There was a little wait for this episode, but we've been trying to make a lot of changes. And as a result of that, dates got pushed back. There was a flu going around for both me and my editor, Trish. And there were some scheduling conflicts that happened after that. And, well, I'm also a single dad, and so there were times when I just couldn't find the time for a recording in any of that capacity at all, despite really, really, really wanting to make time for that. That said, this story is brought in from one of our viewers, Brian Temple. Brian Temple lives in the northern peninsula of Newfoundland and Labrador, and he's a writer who is just starting out, just starting to make a name for himself. He's a pretty shy guy, as most writers are, but his prose is actually very poetic, and it's one of the most interesting stories I've come across. The premise is what would happen if a Neanderthal happened to make the journey all the way across the amazing ice bridge in along the Bering Strait way back when, roughly 40,000 years ago, I think. No, it might be closer to 12,000. I'm not sure. The dates are a little confusing. And somehow wound up separated from his tribe, this Neanderthal, and found his way to Newfoundland and Labrador. It's a really creative premise, and it might not be entirely realistic from the known timeline of humanity, but if there's one thing that we are starting to discover, it's that the timeline of humanity is a lot more blurry than one might anticipate. So let's jump in to this amazing story by Brian Temple, Newfoundland Neanderthal. Newfoundland Neanderthal by Brian Temple. Narrated by me, T.C. Bursey. The wind howled through the ancient spruce, biting and cold, carrying with it the scent of salt water. The sky was a flat gray, the kind that draped over the world like a heavy blanket. Somewhere in the distance, the waves crashed against jagged rocks, a sound that echoed through the wilderness. In the woods, deep in the heart of this strange, isolated world, something moved. A figure, tall and broad-shouldered, covered in thick fur pelts. His heavy steps in the snow were beginning to slow him. His face was rough, framed by a beard of tangled hair, his skin weathered by years of living in an unforgiving, wild world. His name was Korg, and he was a hunter. Though not like the others. He was something else entirely. Korg was a Neanderthal. The wind had carried him far, farther than he had intended, farther than he could even comprehend. He had wandered across the land for many winters, his feet taking him from one place to another, always searching, always running. But this land, this place, was different. Korg had once lived among his people, his clan, on the southern edge of a vast frozen landscape. Far from these strange distant shores, he had hunted mammoths and woolly rhinoceros, lived by the fire with his kin, sharing stories of the old world. But one day, a storm had come, a storm like no other. The winds howled with unnatural fury, and the snow fell so thick that Korg had lost his way. He had wandered for days, unable to find shelter or food, until at last he stumbled into the mist and the world had changed around him. When he opened his eyes again, the land had transformed. No longer did the tall glaciers and open plains stretch as far as the eye could see. Instead, he stood amidst trees that were foreign to him, their branches bending low under the weight of fresh snow. The air smelled different there, salt, and something else, something strange. There were no great beasts to hunt, no familiar signs to guide him. Korg had no idea where he was, but he knew one thing. He must survive. Days turned into weeks, and Korg slowly began to learn the ways of this strange land. He followed the animals, the tracks in the snow, and learned to catch smaller prey. He found shelter in caves and hunted what he could, though nothing seemed to satisfy his hunger the way the old world had. Yet the wilds of this new place spoke to him in a way his homeland never had. He could feel the earth rocky beneath his feet, the pulse of the land. It was alive, and it was waiting. It was during one of these hunts that Korg stumbled across something that filled him with wonder and fear. He had been tracking a strange, unfamiliar creature, a large, four-legged beast with a shaggy coat and long horns, when he came upon a narrow pass between two cliffs. The air here was thick with fog, and the ground was slick with ice. As Korg moved cautiously forward, his eyes caught a glimpse of something unusual, a flicker of movement. He froze, crouching low in the snow. Slowly, he moved forward, keeping his breath shallow, careful not to make a sound. There, in the distance, barely visible through the fog, stood a figure. At first, Korg thought it was another human, another hunter, perhaps lost like he had been. But as he drew closer, he realized the figure was not human at all. It was something far stranger. The creature before him was tall, almost as tall as Korg, with long, flowing hair that shimmered silver in the pale light. Its skin was pale as well, almost translucent, and its eyes were wide and blue, like the sky on a clear winter's day. But it was not the creature's appearance that unsettled Korg. It was the way it stood, so still, as if it were part of the landscape itself, part of the ice and the wind. For a long moment, Korg watched the figure, unsure of what to do. He had encountered many strange animals in his time, but this was something else entirely. The figure moved, stepping lightly through the snow, its feet making no sound. Korg felt a strange pull, an instinct to follow, though he couldn't explain why. Without thinking, he began to move toward it, his steps silent in the snow. The figure stopped at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the vast expanse of the sea below. The wind whipped around them both, but neither of them moved. Korg stood at a distance, watching, unsure whether to approach or retreat. And then, without warning, the figure turned on him. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Korg felt his heart pound in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. He had no words, no way to communicate. And yet somehow The figure seemed to understand. It spoke, though not with words. The sound was more of a whisper, a soft, overworldly hum that resonated deep within Korg's bones. "You are not worthy." Korg's breath caught in his throat. The figure's voice was not a voice at all, but a presence, a feeling, an understanding. Korg couldn't comprehend what it meant, but he felt it all the same. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the horizon, toward the sea. And then it turned, its long hair flowing behind it like a veil of mist, and vanished into the fog, leaving Korg alone on the cliff. Korg stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. What had just happened? Was it real, or had his mind simply broken after so many days of wandering alone in the wilderness? The next day, Korg followed the path the figure had shown him. He did not know why, only that something inside him told him to do so. The journey took him along the rugged coast, through thick forests and across frozen rivers. He encountered strange creatures along the way. Animals unlike anything he had ever seen, some of them terrifying, others beautiful in their own way. But through it all, he felt the pull of the sea, the pull of the horizon. As he walked, he came across something else, something that made his heart race. As he walked, he knew what it was. His hands began to tremble. It was a village. It was unlike any village Korg had ever seen before. There were no caves, no fires burning in the center, no animals scattered about. Instead, there were strange buildings, tall wooden structures with roofs that slanted toward the sky. The people who lived here were unlike any he had ever encountered. They were pale-skinned, like the figure from the cliff, but they moved quickly, their hands busy with work. Some of them spoke to each other, though Korg could not understand the words. He watched them from a distance, hidden in the trees. For the first time in many moons, Korg felt the stirrings of something familiar: curiosity and fear. In the days that followed, Korg cautiously approached the village. He watched the people from the shadows, trying to learn their ways, their language. He mimicked their movements, learned how they gathered food, how they made tools. But it was clear that he was different, far different. He was not one of them. One evening, as the sun began to set, Korg was standing by a fire, watching the flames dance in the wind, when a figure approached him. It was a woman, one of the villagers, her skin pale and her hair dark as night. She looked at him with wide eyes, her face a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You are not from here," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Who are you?" Korg opened his mouth, but no words came. He had no language for this moment, no way to explain himself. "I am Korg," he said at last, his voice rough and unfamiliar in his own ears. "I lost my way." The woman studied him for a moment, and then, to Korg's surprise, she smiled. "You're far from home, Korg," she said gently, "but we can help you find your way. You're not alone here." For the first time in many moons, Korg felt a glimmer of hope. Over the following months, Korg was taken in by the villagers. They were wary of him at first. An enormous woman, wild, spoke no language they understood, came up to Korg, and Korg was patient. He observed their ways, mimicking their movements, and slowly, through gestures and shared experience, he began to communicate. The villagers were farmers and fishermen, their lives centered around the sea and the land that stretched before them. Korg learned how they built their homes, cultivated crops, and fished in the icy waters. But still, there was something about the place that felt wrong to him. The people were kind enough, yes, but there was an unsettling sense of fragility about their world. They were fragile compared to the might of the great creatures he had once known. The mammoths, the bears, the wolves, and other Neanderthals. These people, they lived in a world where nature seemed far less wild, less unforgiving. Korg felt both a deep respect for the land and a strange, lingering fear. He longed for something more, something stronger. It was during one of his quiet moments by the fire, watching the flickering light dance across his fur-clad body, that the village leader approached him. She was that larger, elder woman, with sharp eyes and an air of an authority. "You are not like us, Korg," she said. "You are of a different time, of a different place. Why do you stay here?" Korg, Korg looked her in the eyes and realized she knew the truth of him, knew that he was no mere wanderer, but something ancient, something forgotten by most, something that had been lost through time somehow as well as space. "I was lost," he said simply, his voice gravelly. "I followed the wind, and it brought me here. I have nowhere else to go." The woman nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Then perhaps you belong here, with us. But remember this, Korg. The world changes, and what was once a home may no longer be a place of refuge." Korg pondered her words long after she had gone. Was this truly his home now? Could he ever be truly one of them? Years passed, and Korg's place in the village solidified. He became a legend in his own right, a towering figure in the village's history, a man from the ice who had walked out of the past. He hunted for the village, helped in their fishing expeditions, and even taught some of them the ways of his people, how to track the animals, how to build shelters from the snow. In return, the villagers shared their knowledge, teaching him the ways of the earth, the plant life, the stars. Korg learned much as well, but there was still part of him that yearned for something more. He would often wander alone to the cliffs, overlooking the sea, remembering the mist-covered figure he had seen long ago. What had it meant? Was it a message, or simply a figment of his wandering mind? One evening, after a particularly harsh winter, when the snow had begun to recede and the first signs of spring appeared on the horizon, Korg stood at the cliff's edge once more. The wind had died down, and the sea below shimmered under the fading light of day. He felt a presence beside him. Turning, he saw the figure once more, the figure of the pale-skinned being with long silver hair. It was just as he remembered, as if time had not passed at all. The figure spoke, but its words were not of this world. "He left Skorg, but remember, this land is not your home. The world calls to you, as it always has. The winds will guide you when the time is right." Korg nodded slowly, a deep understanding settling within him. He knew that this place and this village was not forever. He had learned from them, shared his strength, and grown in ways he had never imagined. But like the winds, his journey was not yet done. When the time came,
Korg would leave. But until then, he would live in peace among those who had accepted him as one of their own. And perhaps one day the land would call him again. Until then, he would remain the Newfoundland Neanderthal. Wow.
That was a great tale. I really, really enjoyed that. For some reason, narrating it again felt like reading it for the first time, and wow, it was really good. All credit to Brian Temple. Didn't disclose the town, only that he's from Northern Peninsula. That was a really good story. And if you have a story you'd like to submit to Stories from the Rock, go ahead. Just try to keep it between 3,000 and 10,000 words, or roundabouts. And yeah, we might be narrating your tale next time. Until then, thanks for listening. Join us next Friday for more stories from the Rock.